I've been reading this book about Spain, A Concise History of Spain by, who's it by? William Phillips and Carla Phillips. And one fascinating thing I learned was that Isabel, she was a princess. She was the daughter of the king. The king wanted to arrange Isabel to be wedded to this other man. The problem is, Isabel didn't want to be arranged to be married to this man. She wanted to marry her cousin Fernando. The king didn't know Fernando. The king didn't like Fernando, but Isabel wanted to marry Fernando. So Isabel, in fact, married Fernando. Fernando then claimed power because he was married to Isabel, who was the king's daughter. And the king, of course, wanted to meet Fernando, so he arranged a dinner with Isabel and Fernando. And it was a nice dinner. They came over and sat down, and during this dinner, the king of Spain was poisoned. He died. And nobody really knows how. I believe it was arsenic poisoning, which is pretty wild. And I believe, unless I'm wrong, I think it remains a mystery as to how that in fact happened. But after that, Isabel and Fernando assumed power. And what I get from that story, among many other fascinating and kind of horrific things that happened in history, is really to expect the unexpected. And I apply this principle to software development because in software development, I have also learned to expect the unexpected. You really don't know what's going to happen sometimes. Despite how good of code you think you wrote, how good a system you designed, how many diagrams you made, how much documentation you wrote, despite all of that, sometimes the system can just break. Sometimes computers get in a bad state. It's in their nature. And that's where we get the common expression of, have you tried turning it off and turning it back on again? The common question, I should say. It's because computers get into a bad state. They operate on zeros and ones. And sometimes, for whatever reason, things just happen. And we have to expect the unexpected. When I write code, one way this comes out is that I often try to write logic inside of some form of retry policy or a try catch or something similar. And even in spots where I don't anticipate a problem happening, because what I've learned over the course of 6 years is that a lot of times it's the spots that we don't think something's going to happen to that actually is the spot that breaks, is the spot that throws an error, an exception, and maybe even a critical error that brings down the system. And it's just in our nature to not assume, right? It's in our nature to assume that the spot we think is the best, that we have the most confidence in, is not going to break. And I've learned it's really the opposite. Sometimes I've wrote code that I thought for sure was going to be, just was going to be problematic, just given, the complexity of the logic, what it was doing, and just various other reasons. But sometimes that code was the most problem-free code. And sometimes the code that I was the most confident in was actually the most problematic, the most prone to bugs, produce bugs. And that's very fascinating. It's a fascinating commentary on the experience of software development because it's almost like it's a rite of passage to learn from our mistakes, right? It's almost like it's a rite of passage to learn that code sometimes seemingly has a mind of its own. Despite how much testing we do, how many unit tests, regression tests, despite how many times we reread the syntax and the code, despite how much review we get on the pull request, sometimes things just happen. Sometimes things just slip under the radar and they make bugs. And sometimes fixing those bugs leads to the creation of new bugs. And that's just the job. And that's why this job can be challenging, and it can be challenging mentally, is because of the fact that we have to always be expecting the unexpected. And when the unexpected inevitably arrives, what do we do about it? And how do we make sure that next time it happens, we're ready for it? When I read history is full of just crazy, off the wall scenarios that you never would have dreamed possible. And a lot of them are very horrific, and a lot of them are very surprising, to say the least. And a lot of it is very unexpected. And so I get a lot from reading history, and sometimes as I read history, I feel like I'm reading a little bit into the nature of software development because we're trying to program these worlds, we're trying to program for all these scenarios, we're trying to anticipate future events, we're trying to guess how the user is going to use something, we're trying to guess what the state of the system is going to be in given these different parameters. And sometimes we just get it wrong. And sometimes we don't account for all the edge cases. And sometimes errors just get thrown. And sometimes the computer crashes and many other things can happen. And it's hard to account for all the edge cases. It's hard to always be accounting for the unexpected because the unexpected a lot of times is unknown. And accounting for unknowns is one of the more difficult parts about this job. And it's not really something that can be taught. It's not really something that can be learned beforehand. It's really something that has to be picked up in practice, that has to be picked up as you go. You know, it's funny because we try to create these best practices that account for all of these edge cases, that account for all the exceptions, the errors, and we try to come up with best practices that really future proof our code, right? Try to make it more resilient. But guess what? It seems like we still have a lot of the same bugs decades later. And this is not due to us not knowing what they are. It's due to new scenarios, new edge cases, and new developments always being created in the real world. There's always these new scenarios that are just flat out impossible to account for. But the result of not accounting for them leads to the same bugs that we've been dealing with at the very beginning. It's very fascinating. And I mean, if you have any insights into anything you've read in history, anything that you've read that has made you think about this, let me know. I'm really interested to learn what you all think. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.